So Acts chapter 25 tonight, we continue to pick the story up. We know about the accusations against Paul for the last few chapters. I was thinking this week since we last met, the same spirit, the same group, the same spirit that was in the group that persecuted Jesus and wanted him dead, not just silenced, seems to be very similar with Paul. They are doggedly pursuing him, even traveling to different cities, if you've noticed, and that continues, that his own people, the Jewish religious people, the high priest and the member in the church, was causing him all the problems, not unsaved people, not the lost. Same as with Jesus. And I think their power base was threatened. Just like with Jesus, he taught something radically different than what it had evolved to with the Pharisees and their teaching. Well, Paul, again, was teaching something different that would rob them of their influence and their power, decision-making power over people. So now we go to chapter 25 with that in mind. First three verses. Now when Festus was come to the province, after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him, and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. They didn't want Paul to have another trial. They wanted him sent to Jerusalem with the express purpose that they could ambush him and kill him. So I'm saying this spirit of wanting to, we have the saying today, don't kill the messenger, which means if somebody brings a bad message, they're just the bearer of the message. They wanted Paul silenced with the same ferocity that they wanted Jesus silenced, and they were willing to kill him for that. Acts 24, the last chapter, ended with the transition from Felix to now the province of Festus. So similar names but different people. Felix, I said last week, undoubtedly a bad man. He ruled poorly, made poor decisions, took bribes. History records that he was a very poor leader. Festus, however, was basically a good fella in a lot of respects. Not all, which I'll come back to that. He governed well, despite all the problems left to him by Felix. So the very fact that he said after 3 days he left Caesarea to go to Jerusalem hints at the energetic leadership of Festus. He knew that Jerusalem was the most important city of the providence, and he wanted to go there. So right away, the high priest and the other men of the Jews came and made their case, without any proof, against Paul, and told him that they, the same charges, and remember Luke's writing this account, that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in wait along the side of the road to ambush and kill him. That was their intent. See, these religious leaders weren't dumb. They knew that Paul would be acquitted in any fair trial, so they didn't want him on trial again. They wanted to ambush him before that trial could take place. These were religious men, religious leaders, but their actions show the danger of religion that's not in contact with the God. Religion that's not in contact with the true Creator. It's very dangerous. If your religion makes you a liar and a murderer, there's something wrong with your religion. And that's how it was with these men. A couple chapters back in Acts chapter 23, we saw the growth of corruption in the high priest and in the other Jews. That's where the plot to murder Paul was first launched. But 2 chapters ago, it was the zealots who were responsible. Now it seems that the leaders are initiating this very same thing among themselves. So Festus, however, is pretty smart. Look with me at verse 4. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly there. He says, no, I'm not going to send him. I'm going to go there myself. Let them therefore, said he, which is among you which are able, go down with me and accuse the man if there be any wickedness in him. Festus was willing to put Paul on trial to resolve the matter, yet he insisted that it would happen in Caesarea, not Jerusalem. Verse 6. And when they had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting in the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. I love how Luke, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, puts that in, which they could not prove. Verse 8, while he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended anything at all. Paul knew where he stood legally. Remember, a couple times now I've shown the things that you could not do to a Roman citizen. They now knew Paul was a Roman citizen, so he had a lot of benefits that the average person wouldn't have. So he couldn't be tried without a fair trial and without proof. These religious leaders wanted him tried without proof. Sound familiar? That sounds an awful lot like what they did with Jesus. Trumped up charges, no real proof. Jesus had only done good. Paul had only done good. He wasn't hurting them or harming them. So Festus does not go with what they said. He does not allow them to manipulate him. Grievous complaints, but Paul said, you know what? I have not done anything against them or against the temple or against Caesar. Now, here's where politics come in, verse 9. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Even if Festus was a good guy, he still wanted to keep his relationship with the Jews in his province on good terms. So he basically wanted to make both parties happy. Paul confidently rested in the fact that he had done his integrity, that he had done nothing wrong. So Festus, trying to please both sides, asked Paul if he was willing to go and be judged of these things. Notice what Paul says. Verse 10. Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. So Paul was confident that integrity was on his side, and he had appealed to Caesar, and he said, if I'm going to be judged, then I want to be judged by Caesar, which is what would happen with a Roman citizen. It was amazing. As large and powerful as Rome was, any Roman citizen that wanted to appeal to Caesar would be judged by him personally. He could go and have an audience before the emperor. So it was the right of every Roman to do that if there was insufficient proof. This was in effect the appeal to the Supreme Court of the Roman Empire. John Calvin cited this. He said, God has appointed a court of laws and also people liberty to use them lawfully. Oftentimes God will use the very laws here on earth for his own good and for his own causes. This plea, by the way, was to Caesar Nero, who was later on a notorious enemy of Christians, but that was later on in his career. But the first 5 years of his reign, this is an important fact too. He had good men around him, the emperor did, and he was regarded as wise and just. Paul had no reason at this time to believe that Nero would be against Christians. Later on he would prove to be, but not at the beginning of his reign. I just thought that was interesting that, again, who we surround ourselves with and who surrounds us often has a big influence on us, emperor or not. Okay, so this isn't really a trial coming up here in verse 13. It's more of a hearing. Notice what happens. Let's go back to verse 12. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appeared unto Caesar? Unto Caesar thou shalt go. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to visit or salute Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's case unto the king, saying, There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have a judgment against him, to whom I answered not. It's not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before he is, which the accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they came here without any delay on the morrow, I sat in the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth, against whom the accusers stood up, and they brought none accusations of such as I expected or as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed was still alive. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem, and whether he would be judged on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved to the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept, that I might send him to Caesar. So he tells the story to Agrippa. By the way, if you wondered who Bernice was, that's Agrippa's sister. Yeah, it's bad. There's even more to that story. This Agrippa goes all the way back to the same Agrippa that wanted to kill all the children. It's a family pattern. So this Herod Agrippa was a client kingdom of the Roman Empire, and he was known. The reason he was telling, and liked the fact that Agrippa came to visit him, was Agrippa was familiar with the Jews. He knew their religion, he knew what they believed, he knew their traditions, he knew their customs. So he didn't have jurisdiction over Paul in this case, but he would be helpful to Festus by hearing the story, and Festus knew that. This is actually the great-grandfather tried to kill Jesus as a baby. His grandfather had John the Baptist beheaded. So you can see what runs in this family. His father had murdered the first apostle James. Now Paul stood before him next in the line of the Herods, Herod Agrippa. So that lets us know who this was. And again, Bernice was his sister. Secular history records that their relationship was incestuous. So he didn't rule over the territory, but he had great influence because the emperor gave him the right to oversee the affairs of the temple and the appointment of the high priest. He had a say in that also. So Festus lays out Paul's case before the king. Festus is new to his post. He followed Felix, perhaps unfamiliar with the Jewish traditions and the customs, and he seemed to be genuinely confused by Paul's case. He's, as much as saying, I don't know why they want him dead. He hasn't done anything worthy of death. I can't find, who's that sound like? That sounds like Pilate. Again, the false trumped up allegations and charges with no proof, and certainly nothing worthy of death. So it was a little confusing to Festus, but he thought Agrippa, who knew the Jews much better, could help out. So as I said, this was really a hearing, not a trial, because Agrippa didn't have jurisdiction, but he could really help. Then verses 14 through 22, he explains the case against Paul. He goes back and tells exactly, Felix left him, the Jews and the elders came asking for a judgment against him. He's talking about some Jesus who died, but Paul seems to think he's still alive. See, he's confused by this whole story. And then he finds out Paul's a Roman citizen, appeals to Caesar, and so I thought it best that I, hold him and send him to Caesar. And that's what Agrippa said to Festus. I'd like to hear him myself. Agrippa was intrigued. And that's when Festus said, okay, tomorrow you'll hear him. So they went on with whatever they were doing, probably a party-like atmosphere, like the video we just watched. Big pomp and circumstance whenever they got together. And it's going to be even bigger pomp and circumstance when he goes before Festus. The religious leaders hoped that Festus would decide against Paul without ever even hearing Paul's defense. They just thought their accusation's enough. He wouldn't want to be bothered with hearing any more details, but that's not what happened. It's not the custom of the Romans. This was a strong tradition of Roman law. He wouldn't condemn Paul without a fair trial. So Festus was surprised, thinking their accusations against Paul were unimportant, that they had to do with their religion and some Jesus who had died. Apparently he didn't know about Jesus. He didn't, we're finding out, one commentator put this, it's amusing to think of the religious leaders protesting to Festus that Paul won't stop talking about this risen Jesus, hoping that the governor would make Paul stop. The words, a certain Jesus, show that Festus didn't really know much about Jesus. It's good for us to remember as we read this, the great important people of Paul's day didn't know automatically about Jesus. They had to be told. Remember what God's charge was to Paul? I'm going to send you before leaders, both the Jews and the Gentiles, to testify of me. This is why even today, you and I must keep on preaching the gospel, because people need told. I used to think that, especially in our country, we were gospel saturated, but the longer I live, I kind of agree with this thought that, people have surprisingly little genuine information beyond what maybe a bumper sticker or a conversation maybe half-hearted or something they've watched on TV. They really do kind of we need to go into detail about telling them about the Christian life, what it's really all about, and about Jesus. It's the same thing here. And what a wonderful opportunity God is using these circumstances to give Paul a chance to talk to important people who are going to have an influence because others are going to hear about them. The masses, Spurgeon said, of the city are as ignorant of Jesus as Festus was. And I believe in a lot of ways he's right. All right, verse 23. So the next day, on the morrow, when Agrippa was come and Bernice with great pomp, Luke writes that, great ceremony, and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains, the principal men of the city, Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth. So the scene is set. Now this is a big deal. It was held in an auditorium. All the commanders, all the prominent men of the city were there. So as I said, this was another tremendous opportunity for God to use Paul. At Festus' command, surrounded by important and powerful people of Caesarea and beyond, Paul came into the auditorium. All the pomp and pageantry was meant to communicate who was important and who wasn't important. Not everyone present, except possibly Paul, was wrong in their estimation of who was important and who was not. Paul had authority and a dignity greater than any of the important people at this hearing. I thought about this. All these very important people would be greatly surprised and not a little scandalized could they have foreseen that later generations would look at them as just characters in the story, but Paul, the main deal. That's not how they looked at it here. Paul was nothing. They were just gathering together to have a hearing and to have an event. They were important. But now looking back on history, the only one, and he didn't even claim importance for himself, was the Apostle Paul. He was the main character in this story, and they didn't realize who it was that stood before them, much like the people of Jesus' time. So Festus now makes an opening statement in verse 24. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. Again, they were serious about this. But when I found, verse 25, that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him before you, and specifically before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have something to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not signify the crimes he had laid before him. All right, let's stop there and talk about that. Interesting. Usually when you would send a prisoner to someone, you know, here's what he did. Here's the charges. Here's what I know about it. He didn't know what to write. So he just tells him, he said, I brought him here and I know this is unusual, but I don't know